It started with a simple knock on the door and a kind gesture, a casserole for a lonely neighbor. But what happens when quiet conversations evolve into something more dangerous? Could I risk everything for the way he made me feel alive again? Before we dive into this story of forbidden connection and life-altering choices, make sure to subscribe for more captivating tales, and let me know where you're watching from today. The warm glow of the single kitchen light reflected off the crystal glass as I poured a splash of red wine. My fingers brushed against his as I handed it over, and I felt the heat rise to my face. "Mr." Grant chuckled softly, the sound low and rumbling, the kind of laugh that came from someone who'd seen the world but didn't take it too seriously. "Careful there," he said, his tone teasing but his gaze searching. "You might make me feel young again." I laughed, a little too loudly, hoping it would drown out the awkward flutter in my chest. "Oh, stop it, Mr. Grant. You've always been young at heart." I tried to sound casual, but my voice betrayed me, the edge of nervousness clear. He tilted his head, his eyes crinkling at the corners in that familiar way that always put me at ease. This was supposed to be simple and neighborly gesture. His wife was away visiting her sister for a few weeks, and I'd offered to help him with a few household chores she usually took care of. But tonight, the atmosphere felt different. The usual light banter had given way to something quieter, heavier, and I wasn't sure who had changed the tone first. "Emma," he said softly, setting his glass down on the table. My name sounded different when he said it gentler, like it carried more meaning than it should. "You don't have to keep coming over here. I know you're busy." I shook my head quickly. "It's no trouble. Really. I like the company, that much was true. My own house felt cold these days, even when my husband was home. Especially when he was home." He leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "Well, I appreciate it. More than I can say." His words hung in the air, weighty and unspoken truths wrapped around them. He looked down at his hands, weathered and strong from years of work, before reaching for the glass again. "Sometimes," he continued, almost to himself, "it feels like the years just pile up, and you wake up wondering if you've spent them the right way." I didn't know what to say. His words echoed something deep inside me, a truth I hadn't dared admit even to myself. I took a sip of wine, hoping it would steady me, but it only made my heart race faster. The storm outside intensified, rain pattering against the windows, a sharp contrast to the silence between us. It was as though the world outside was mirroring what I felt inside, chaos beneath a quiet exterior. I glanced at him, his face lit softly by the warm light, and for a fleeting moment, I wondered what he saw when he looked at me. The next morning, I woke up with a gnawing sense of guilt. Last night played on a loop in my mind, the way Mr. Grant's eyes lingered, just a second too long, the softness of his voice when he said my name. My husband, Mark, was already up and scrolling through his phone on the couch, as he did every morning. I sat across from him, my coffee warm in my hands, hoping he might notice my unease. But he didn't. "Do you have any meetings today?" I asked, trying to strike up a conversation. He grunted, not looking up. "A couple. Why?" "No reason," I muttered, staring into my coffee. Mark's indifference felt heavier than ever, his detachment more suffocating than usual. It wasn't that we fought or had any major issues, it was the absence of anything. No warmth, no tenderness. We were two people sharing a house, a schedule, and little else. Later, as I stepped out to run errands, I found myself driving past Mr. Grant's house. His porch light was on, and the newspaper sat untouched on the steps. Without thinking, I pulled into his driveway and knocked on the door. He opened it quickly, dressed in an old flannel shirt and jeans, his gray hair slightly tousled. He smiled when he saw me. "Emma, good morning. What brings you by?" "I was running errands nearby and thought I'd check in." "You didn't grab your paper," I said, gesturing to the steps. He laughed lightly. Ah, the little things you forget when there's no one around to remind you. Come in. I stepped inside, and the familiar warmth of his house enveloped me. It always smelled faintly of cedarwood and the coffee he brewed religiously every morning. The kitchen table was scattered with old photos and letters. He noticed me looking and gestured to them. I was going through some old memories, he explained. Thought it was about time to clear out some of the clutter. I picked up a photo of him and his wife from what looked like decades ago. She was stunning, with a bright smile and sparkling eyes that mirrored his. You two look so happy, I said softly. We were, he said, his tone bittersweet. Things change, though. She's a good woman, don't get me wrong, but life pulls people in different directions sometimes. I nodded, unsure of how to respond. His honesty disarmed me. Do you miss her? I asked hesitantly. He looked at me, his eyes soft but guarded. I miss who we used to be together. His words struck a chord. I thought of my own marriage, of the version of Mark and me that existed when we first fell in love. The long conversations, the shared laughter, the feeling that we were a team. Now, it felt like we were just going through the motions. We spent the rest of the morning talking. He told me stories about his younger days, his time as a school principal, the mischievous students who kept him on his toes, the adventures he and his wife used to have. I laughed more in that hour than I had in weeks. It felt easy, natural, like slipping into a warm bath after a cold day. When I finally left, the weight I'd been carrying felt lighter. But as I drove home, a new weight settled in its place, the awareness of how much I enjoyed being with him. Over the next week, I found excuses to visit Mr. Grant. I brought over meals, helped him with chores, or simply stopped by to chat. Each visit felt like an escape, a breath of fresh air in the stifling monotony of my life. One afternoon, I brought over a batch of cookies I'd baked. He greeted me at the door with a smile. You're spoiling me, Emma. If you keep this up, I'll never want my wife to come back. The joke caught me off guard and I laughed nervously. Don't say that. She'd have my head if she heard you. He shrugged, his smile softening. She's not much for the kitchen these days anyway. Too busy with her clubs and travels. But these he took a bite of a cookie, closing his eyes in exaggerated bliss. ... Our heavenly. We settled into his living room, the late afternoon sun streaming through the windows. He showed me more photos, this time of his children and grandchildren. They don't visit as often as I'd like, he said, his voice tinged with sadness. Everyone's so busy these days. Have you told them you miss them? I asked gently. He sighed. It's hard to ask for attention, you know. Feels selfish. I thought about my own family. How often did I let pride or fear stop me from saying what I needed? It's not selfish, Mr. Grant. Sometimes people just need a reminder that they're wanted. He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. That's wise advice, Emma. Maybe I'll take it, and maybe you should, too. His words hit me like a thunderclap. Was it that obvious? Could he see through the carefully constructed facade of my marriage? I wanted to protest, to change the subject, but the truth hung between us, unspoken but undeniable. By the end of the week, the dynamic between us had shifted subtly but unmistakably. Our conversations grew deeper, more personal. He asked about my life, my dreams, my frustrations, and I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't in years. One evening, as I was leaving, he stopped me at the door. Emma, can I ask you something? Of course, I said, turning to face him. Are you happy? The question caught me off guard. It was such a simple question, but the answer felt impossibly complicated. I hesitated, searching for the right words. I'm content. He frowned slightly. Content isn't the same as happy. I forced a smile, brushing off the heaviness of the moment. I should go. It's getting late. He nodded, stepping back to let me pass. But as I walked away, I felt his eyes on me, heavy with unspoken thoughts. The visits continued, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on the edge of something. A storm brewing just beneath the surface. And as much as I tried to convince myself that our connection was harmless, I knew I was lying to myself. I wasn't just helping a lonely neighbor. I was seeking something I hadn't even realized I was missing. The storm that had been gathering between Mr. Grant and me finally broke on a Friday evening. I'd brought over a casserole, not because he needed it, but because I wanted an excuse to see him again. Mark was working late again, and I couldn't bear another evening alone with the silence in my own house. When I arrived, he was on the porch, rocking slowly in his chair. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood. He smiled when he saw me, a genuine, unguarded smile that made my heart skip a beat. "Emma," he greeted, standing to take the dish from my hands. "You're going to make me fat with all this good cooking." I laughed, stepping inside. "You're in good shape, Mr. Grant. A little extra weight wouldn't hurt." He set the casserole on the counter, then turned to face me, his expression serious. "Please call me Robert. We've spent enough time together that I think we can drop the formalities." The way he said it, Robert, felt intimate, like a secret we were now sharing. I nodded, my voice catching in my throat. "All right, Robert." We settled into the living room, the hum of the ceiling fan the only sound between us. He poured us each a glass of wine, and we talked about everything and nothing. But tonight there was an edge to our conversation, an undercurrent of something unsaid. His gaze lingered a little too long. His voice softened in a way that made my skin prickle. At one point, he leaned back in his chair and looked at me thoughtfully. "You know, Emma, you've been such a light in my life these past few weeks. I didn't realize how much I'd been missing until you came around." I froze, the words hitting me square in the chest. "You don't mean that," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. I do. His eyes were steady, unwavering. "You've reminded me of things I thought I'd forgotten, what it feels like to connect with someone, to really talk and laugh. It's been a long time since I felt alive." My heart raced, a mixture of exhilaration and fear. "Robert," I trailed off, unsure of what I was trying to say. Was I going to tell him he was wrong? That I didn't feel the same? The words wouldn't come because they weren't true. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Do you ever feel like life just slips away from you? Like you wake up one day and realize you've been living the same day over and over and you don't know how to break free?" "Yes," I whispered. The word was out before I could stop it. Every day. For a long moment, we just looked at each other, the weight of our shared confession hanging heavy in the air. And then, slowly, he reached out and covered my hand with his. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental, like crossing an invisible line we'd both been tiptoeing around. The moment passed, but the tension lingered. I left soon after, my thoughts a whirlwind. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Robert's words echoing in my mind. I thought about Mark, about how he hadn't asked me about my day in months, about how he barely looked up from his phone when I spoke. And then I thought about Robert, about how he saw me, really saw me, in a way no one had in years. The next day, I told myself I wouldn't visit him. I needed distance, clarity. But by afternoon, I found myself standing on his porch again. He opened the door, surprise flickering across his face before it was replaced by a warm smile. "I didn't expect to see you today," he said. "I thought I'd check in," I replied, my voice shaky. "I was in the neighborhood." He stepped aside to let me in, and we settled into our usual spots in the living room, but today the air between us felt charged, electric. We danced around the tension, talking about the weather, the neighbors, anything but what we were both feeling. Finally, he broke the silence. "Emma, we can't keep pretending this isn't happening." I stared at him, my heart pounding. "What do you mean?" "You know what I mean." His voice was steady, but there was a vulnerability in his eyes. "There's something between us. I feel it, don't you?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. The truth was too dangerous, too heavy. Instead, I looked down at my hands, twisting them nervously in my lap. He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said anything. It's just, you're the first person who's made me feel like this in a long time." "Robert," I began, but my voice cracked. I cleared my throat and tried again. "This is wrong. You know that, right? You're married and I am married too," he finished for me. "I know. Believe me, I know. But that doesn't change how I feel." His honesty was disarming, and I found myself unable to deny the feelings I'd been trying so hard to suppress. "It doesn't matter how we feel," I said finally. "We can't act on it." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "I know, but that doesn't make it any easier." The room fell silent, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall. For the first time, I felt the full weight of what we were risking, the pain it could cause, the lives it could upend. But beneath the fear was something else, something I couldn't ignore, the pull of a connection I hadn't felt in years. As the weeks went on, we tried to maintain our distance, but it was impossible. Every time I saw him, the unspoken feelings between us grew stronger. One evening, he invited me over for dinner. Just as friends, he said, but we both knew better. The meal was simple roast chicken and vegetables, but the atmosphere was anything but. The soft glow of candlelight, the quiet music playing in the background, the way his eyes lingered on mine, all of it felt intimate, charged. After dinner, we sat on the couch, talking quietly. At some point, his hand found mine, and this time I didn't pull away. "Emma," he said softly, his voice trembling. "Don't," I whispered, cutting him off. "Please, don't say it." But it was too late. The line between us had already blurred, and there was no going back. That night, I left Robert's house feeling the weight of everything we had said and everything we hadn't. The touch of his hand lingered like a phantom against my skin, and his eyes, filled with longing and regret, stayed with me long after I drove away. I knew something had shifted, something irreversible, and it terrified me. Back at home, I found Mark asleep on the couch, the television casting flickering blue light across his face. I stood there for a moment, watching him, trying to remember the man I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. He looked peaceful, but the chasm between us felt insurmountable. I didn't wake him. Instead, I slipped into bed and lay staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. The next day, I avoided Robert. I needed space to think, to figure out what I was doing and why. But staying away was harder than I expected. Every quiet moment felt like an eternity, my thoughts circling back to him, to the warmth of his smile and the way he made me feel seen. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something I couldn't ignore. A few days later, I found myself back on his porch, unable to stay away any longer. He opened the door, surprise flickering across his face before his expression softened into something warmer. "Emma," he said simply, stepping aside to let me in. We didn't speak right away. Instead, we settled into the living room, the silence between us both comforting and charged. Finally, he broke it. "I thought I scared you off," he admitted, his voice low. "You didn't scare me," I said, my hands twisting nervously in my lap. I needed time to think." "And what did you decide?" he asked, his eyes searching mine. I hesitated, unsure of how to put my feelings into words. I don't know, I said finally. I know this isn't right. But I also know I don't want to lose you. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze steady. You don't have to lose me. We can figure this out. Figure what out, Robert, I asked, frustration creeping into my voice. This, whatever this is, it's impossible. You're married. I'm married. I'm married. There's no way this ends without someone getting hurt. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked down at his hands, his expression thoughtful. You're right, he said finally. But that doesn't mean we can't be honest with each other. I nodded slowly, my heart heavy. Honesty is one thing, but where does it lead us? What happens if we cross a line we can't uncross? He reached out and took my hand, his grip firm but gentle. It's not about crossing lines, Emma. It's about acknowledging what we feel and finding a way to live with it, together or apart. His words stayed with me long after I left. I knew he was right. We couldn't ignore what was between us, but we also couldn't let it destroy the lives we had built. For the next week, I tried to throw myself into my marriage, to rekindle something that had been lost. I cooked Mark's favorite meals, planned a weekend getaway, and even suggested counseling. But nothing seemed to penetrate the wall he had built around himself. One evening, as we sat eating dinner in silence, I finally worked up the courage to speak. Mark, I said, setting down my fork, can we talk? He glanced up from his plate, his brow furrowing. About what? About us, I said, my voice trembling. I feel like we've been drifting apart, and I don't know how to fix it. He sighed, leaning back in his chair. Emma, I don't know what you want from me. I go to work, I provide for us, I'm here. What more do you need? I need you, I said, my voice breaking. Not just your presence, but your attention, your love. I feel like we're just roommates, and I can't live like this anymore. His expression softened slightly, but there was still a distance in his eyes. I'm sorry you feel that way, he said, but I don't know how to be what you want. His words felt like a knife to the heart. For so long, I had convinced myself that we could find our way back to each other, that we could rebuild what we had lost. But in that moment, I realized the truth he didn't want to. And that hurt more than I could bear. That weekend, Robert called me. I've been thinking, he said. Would you like to go for a walk? Clear our heads? I hesitated, knowing how dangerous it was to spend time alone with him. But I agreed, unable to resist the pull of his company. We met at the park, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the grass. For a while, we walked in silence, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath our feet. Finally, he spoke. I've been doing a lot of soul-searching, he said. And I realized something. My marriage hasn't been a marriage for a long time. It's more of a partnership, a convenience, and I think I've been holding on to it because I'm afraid of what it means to let go. I stopped walking, turning to face him. What are you saying, Robert? I'm saying that meeting you has made me realize I want more, he said, his voice steady. Not just from you, but from life. I don't know what that looks like yet, but I know I can't keep living the way I have been. His honesty took my breath away. I wanted to tell him I felt the same, that he had awakened something in me I hadn't even realized was dormant. But I couldn't. Not yet. You have to do what's right for you, I said finally. But don't do it for me. Do it because it's what you need. Over the next few weeks, things began to change. Robert started making plans to sell his house and move closer to his children, hoping to rebuild those relationships. Meanwhile, I focused on finding clarity in my own life. I talked to Mark about a trial separation, and to my surprise, he didn't fight it. If it's what you need, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. The day Robert left, we stood on his porch, the moving truck idling in the driveway. Thank you, he said, his eyes shining with emotion. For everything. I nodded, my throat tight. Take care of yourself, Robert. He hesitated, then leaned in and kissed my cheek. It was a small gesture, but it felt like goodbye. As he drove away, I stood there, watching until the truck disappeared from view. Months later, I found myself walking through the same park where we'd had our last conversation. The leaves were starting to fall, and the air had a crispness that hinted at the coming winter. I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. My life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was living it for myself. As I turned a corner, I saw a familiar figure sitting on a bench, a book in his hands. He looked up, and our eyes met. Robert smiled, and I felt my heart stir. Maybe this was the start of a new chapter, or maybe it was just a moment to treasure. Either way, I knew one thing for certain: I was finally ready to embrace whatever came next.